You're listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. This is the show that talks about identity and access management and making sure you know who has access to what. Let's get started. Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How are you?
Not so bad. Yourself?
Good. Yeah, I see. Whenever we start the podcast, just for people who are listening on audio, which I guess is everybody, we have video going.
Well, what else would you be listening to? It's not audio.
That's true.
Screens?
That's true. And but we can see each other.
Yeah.
And I always crack a smile, and then you crack a smile because you know I'm going to get into something, and you just don't know what it's going to be. But pretty straightforward. This is
the Jeff React section where I have no idea what Jim is going to say. So for those listening, I intro the show. And then I say, hi, Jim. And then Jim comes at me with something that I have no preparation whatsoever. So this is all thinking on my feet.
Yeah, well, this one's easy because I'm going to base it on real life experience of, I want to talk about the Gartner IAM Summit that we're scheduled to go to. What is that? The 22nd through the 24th. Monday through Wednesday. Yep. And so we've got a recording spot. Now we're going to set up some podcast recordings. So I'm starting to invite people, and I'm letting people know that they need to schedule time to get from wherever they are to the time of their recording, because Caesars might be the biggest maze on the planet. I mean, getting from point A to point B is pretty difficult at times. Usually you figure it out by Wednesday. And it's
just in time to leave. Yeah, it's a big spot. I mean, I think usually if Gartner is where it usually is, and I don't know the name of the spot, but it's kind of like it's got a view overlooking like the pools or whatever it may be. The rooms could be half an hour away, and you and I, and courtesy of our friends at RSM, have a suite that we have booked that will be sort of like our recording home base. I have put in a request to make it as convenient as possible. I know there's a bank of elevators that got to go up and down from where the Gartner area is, but I have no idea if that request will be honored or if it's even available. So we'll see. But yes, if you are planning on being on the show, or even just want to watch a show get recorded, and reach out to Jim and I on LinkedIn and just kind of account for time. I know we're kind of booking things out right now and working through the schedule, but it'd be kind of cool. It'll be the first time Jim and I are actually at a conference together since, as I'll never let him live it down, he ditched me for Authenticate last year with the FIDO conference. But get an opportunity to fist bump, shake hands, whatever the greeting du jour is for the day. And then if you want to watch or be part of a show, let us know. We'll be happy to try and figure out how we can accommodate that.
Jeff, I have a pro tip for getting an upgraded room or whatever your request is. Pictures of Benjamin
$20 bill on palming it to the person checking
$20 bill is, Thomas Jefferson is not going to, or no, that's what Andrew Jackson, not going to get you quite as far as Benjamin Franklin will.
It'll get you an extra towel.
If you want a feather-free room, I think you're in luck with the $20 bill.
Yeah. Do you have an actual tip, or are you going with the palm the cash tip?
It's money, yeah.
I stole your thunder.
Money talks, and the other stuff better be doing the walking.
Yeah, everyone will be doing the walking. That's what Vegas is all about. Anything else, or should we get into our topic?
Let's get into it, man. We've got a lot of ground to cover here.
Yeah, no kidding. We're going to talk about identity and access management, really focusing on the state and local government sector. And to help with that conversation, we've got our new friend, Robert Snodgrass. He's a director in the security practice here with us at RSM. Welcome to the show, Robert.
Yep. Happy to be here. Long-time listener, first-time caller. So thanks for having me on.
If I was brave, I'd use my soundboard to do some kind of wacky sound effect, but just imagine it in your head if you're listening to it right now. It is very cool. It's been great to kind of get to know you for the last couple of months since we've kind of both been onboarded and working through a lot of projects. You've got a ton of experience in this space. One of the things that we like to do when we have a new guest on the show, though, is kind of learn about their origin story and really kind of find out, how did you get into either identity or sort of InfoSec? Is it something that you chose or did it choose you? If you can kind of just walk us through how you got to where you are right now.
Sure. So I've spent my entire career in cybersecurity consulting, and my path to identity, probably like a lot of people, was a bit of a zigzag. I actually initially started my career working in a Big Four focused on actually ERP implementations. And as part of that, gained a bit of notoriety, I call it, some good and some bad, as it related to dealing with distressed projects and helping to bring those projects back on track. So my focus is really around cybersecurity solution delivery. And as part of that path, it led me into both state government as well as specifically the identity sector. And through that, I've had a great opportunity to, take my experience, which initially started in financial services and in particularly Fortune 100 banking. And I've had an opportunity to work with now 7 different state governments on various cyber solutions, including digital identity over the last 10 years.
7 different governments. That's pretty good in 10 years. That's an excellent track record. I guess, I'm going to shamelessly plug your organizational skills because you are one of the most organized people I think that I've ever met.
Some people call that OCD.
Almost frighteningly so.
I think that's quite a compliment coming from you, Jeff, because I was going to say you're one of the most organized people that I've ever met.
Now we're getting into the tiering structure, which means, Jim, you're not organized at all.
I'm not organized at all. No, but I'm doing all the organization for our podcast for Gartner. So enjoy the outcome. Hopefully we have the 9 or 10 sessions recorded that we're hoping for, but no, I think we'll be fine. So Robert, today we wanted to discuss state and local government approaches to digital identity or identity and access management and how they differ from private sector. And I guess, if there's any differences between state and local government, I mean, do they take a different approach than one another? And also we found a recent article that talked about how states have been investing heavily over the past decade into kind of getting their workforce IAM house in order. And now they're kind of shifting their focus for investment into the citizen IAM space. So just wondering if you could maybe talk about that and, explain a little bit about that trend that's happening. Is that something that's happening across the board, or is it something that's just in pockets?
I think to really understand the trend of identity as it relates to state government, we really need to understand the origin of technology as it relates to state government, because it's really very different than what you might see in a traditional, private organization. So 20 years ago, agencies essentially operated independently within the state government landscape. So they had their own directors, they had their own budgets, they had their own IT staff, and for the most part, operated independently as it related to delivery of those solutions. So then in the early 2000s, the legislative body got tired of essentially paying for 100 different IT shops and began to form departments of IT within states. And that's been going on now for the last probably decade or so as these kind of centralized IT departments were generated. That initially started with things like data centers. Obviously, there's huge capital investment, makes a ton of sense for agencies to consolidate that investment into a single location. But with identity, it created a really unique challenge because you have agencies that are typically, potentially very large. Think departments of transportation, departments of health that have 10, 15,000 employees that have their own domain structure. And then how do you collapse that together into unified naming conventions? How do you take this, forest of various active directory domains and unify them? And that's really been the focus over the last 10, 12 years is building that integrated view of what is your workforce identity as it relates to an individual state. I'd say for the most part, states have really gotten over that hurdle within their workforce. And that's really why they're starting to look a little bit down the road and focusing on that citizen persona as you started to touch on. The citizen persona is a bit of a unique concept. And it also isn't a unique concept. So the closest parallel I would put to this is if you really think about a consumer persona, where the start of this was very similar, where it was really meant to be a way as you dealt with education, with transportation, and so forth. How can we build a unified mechanism for individuals to access those services? Basically, how do we reduce the barriers of entry for individuals to come in to a digitized government? Beyond that, though, I think there's some really unique things that states are starting to think about as it relates to the citizen persona, and why I think state may start to see really interesting impacts in the private space. So one is the joining of both digital and physical identities. So if we think about your physical identity as it relates to state government, driver's license, right? A really simple example of how you would go to various state agencies and prove who you are. There's a lot of interesting use cases that are being considered now about, well, how do I join that with a digital identity? And some examples that I saw of recently were things like, if you have your COVID-19 vaccination card, can you put a QR code on that as a way to sort of validate that record and have the most up-to-date information? Or on the flip side, how do I take my physical driver's license and digitize that and make that available to me within my phone in some way, shape, or form?
Real interesting that you went into the driver's license. I'd like to follow up on that, but just had a thought as you were talking about kind of the transition that state governments have made from, having decentralized IT to centralized IT, and kind of the, all the challenges to doing that. I just kind of think there's a lot of big companies that have kind of found themselves going through that same journey, right? If they were, didn't have a push to centralize IT departments within that company early on, well, they built a bunch of infrastructure. Maybe they have some shared infrastructure, like their network layer, and but normally I've seen a lot of companies where Active Directories were separate at one point, and they've had to kind of go through the process of merging it, and really that also kind of sets the stage for other identity and access management challenges. So, I mean, I don't think that's completely unique to states. It sounds to me like that's where almost every state has kind of found themselves. But we see this a lot in like university contexts. I see it a lot in big multinational companies, especially if they've grown by acquisition. Is that kind of your experience as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So I worked for a Fortune 10 bank for 4 years at the start of my career. And a big element that we had to work through is that they grew very rapidly through acquisition. They had organizations almost of equivalent size that they were trying to bring under a single identity umbrella. And I think the challenges that we face there are almost identical to the challenges that we faced within the state government. I think the difference is you're facing them 10, 12, 15 years later. So in some ways, you have the advantage in that you can take those proven use cases from the private sector and really apply them into the public one.
I think that lag is helpful, right? Sometimes it might be a little bit of a hindrance. Or they go, well, why isn't this service easy to use? Like, what do you mean I have to like fill out a piece of paper, right? Like it's 2022, why are we doing that sort of thing? I want to touch back on one thing because I want to get into privacy for a second. But before I get to that, you mentioned earlier on that a lot of legislatures have gotten together to essentially kind of form these centralized departments of IT or services or whatever it might look like. Is that something that you've seen across the board, essentially for like all 50 states, or is that half the states? Like what's been the adoption of that sort of mindset of a central shared infrastructure group of some sort?
At this stage, and I can't speak for all 50 states because I've interacted with all 50 states, but at this stage, beyond serving directly with 7 states, I've probably interacted with another 20 to 25. Every single one of them has some level of centralized IT. The way in which they're funded and the level of service that they provide to both state and or local governments will vary dramatically between states, but all of them will have a central IT department. And in every single one of those circumstances, that is the department that is driving the identity discussion.
It seems to me like it's a great opportunity to have more interoperability between the different states for those types of scenarios, like vaccine or driver's licenses or, other forms of being able to check things, which, if I put my tinfoil hat on, now I'm starting to talk about privacy, and there's this natural reaction of, what is the government doing with my data? We've seen some recent things, at least at the federal level, with things like the IRS and ID.me. I guess from a from a privacy standpoint, what is the sort of data that state or local governments want? What are the constraints that go around how they might utilize it, or, those types of scenarios? Like, what are some of the things that those operations are thinking about to try and protect the citizenry, and their data?
So you mentioned ID.me, but I think probably the better parallel from a state identity to federal identity perspective is login.gov. So login.gov, if you've registered for things like TSA PreCheck or global entry, is the mechanism in which you log in. And so what login.gov did and what states are doing is really trying to build a shared set of piping in order to facilitate authentication. That's primarily what they're driving towards. The privacy question is a good one because in some ways, not to the same extent that the federal government does, but state government has more information about the individual than just about any other industry vertical that's out there. And there is no unifying law around collection and usage of that information. Now, I would say in the last 5 to 10 years, there's been a definite trend with states hiring permanent data privacy officers and or data governance officers to better understand the data they have and how it's being utilized. But laws that people often associate with state privacy, like the California Consumer Protection Act, are focused on consumers, not government services. So there isn't that one place to look at to really understand those questions. And in a lot of cases, you're seeing very agency specific laws and regulations driving that. So Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services, for example, has a view on this. The Social Security Administration has a view on this. The Driver's License Privacy Protection Act has a view on this. And so it's a really hard question to answer sometimes when you're trying to go through this view of how do I balance building out a very robust process to identify and proof an individual, but not create a honeypot of data that both exposes the individual constituent as well as violates their understanding of how that data was going to be utilized.
Yeah, I think that's the main concern, right? Is we're in the age of breaches, so of course, the more data you consolidate into one spot, the more concern there is that all that stuff gets out there. And now we start thinking about things like biometric. You can change your password, you can't change your fingerprint, at least not legally, or maybe even willingly. So things like that become a lot more sensitive from a sharing perspective, and where's it being stored? I think of, you mentioned login.gov, and, I have PreCheck and I have a passport and I use that to log in those types of services. A service like that essentially already exists. Why would another agency even think about using something else from an authentication standpoint? I mean, there probably are certain scenarios like identity proofing, to prevent financial fraud. Maybe that's why IRS didn't look at it, or maybe it didn't meet their needs. But it seems to me like there's still this, as a outsider looking in, like I see what seem to be suitable services, but then it seems like because of all the different use cases or requirements or laws or regulations or whatever they may be, we still haven't come up with a scalable or modular enough way where it's kind of like the no-brainer de facto standard for government services. Yes, I log in with my login.gov in the US. Maybe it's something else in a different country. I think I can't remember the name of the country in Europe, but they're like totally, is it Mauritania or something like that, where they're like 100% digital. And they've kind of figured it out. And it seems they've been that way for a while. Like, why haven't we caught up to that from a centralized standpoint?
I think Estonia actually is one of the ones I was thinking of, where they have a PKI enabled infrastructure for their digital identity. It really interesting. So I think, obviously, any individual state probably has more complexity to it than Estonia does. But, there's a number of kind of deployment related challenges that, as you think about what's the model we even want to apply here, and depending who you ask, they take a very different approach. There's really three views to this at the end of the day. There's a centralized model, there's a federated model, and then there's just a completely decentralized model. So the centralized model is basically what you just talked about with Estonia. And this is the direction that a number of states have gone, like with Ohio and the Innovate Ohio solution, where the Department of IT essentially builds a singular infrastructure for identity. So it has the identity store, it manages the authentication, and you essentially plug into that. It is the IDP for state services. Then you have a more federated system where you can have multiple identity providers that you're utilizing. I think I read an article where it's Canada actually federates with certain banking systems in order to drive identity. And then you can have a totally decentralized, but based on standard integration pattern view, which is really interesting, I think, from a data privacy perspective, because no one controls the full view. And that certainly in and of itself drives kind of a bit more of a container around the data they have. But the complexity of what that really means and the management of it also generates a lot of question marks in my mind. So until we can really come to a conclusion on that, I think that each state is really trying to make that determination on their own.
Wasn't blockchain supposed to solve that for us? I mean, we've been hearing blockchain and block identity things were going to be like the decentralized way to everybody manages their own data and it's going to be a perfect world. And I feel like here we are. I think I first heard about this probably at Gartner like 4 or 5 years ago. And I still haven't, it hasn't gotten anywhere from an identity perspective, even though on the face value is like, oh, that seems like a pretty applicable use case. Civic, healthcare, education. I can see it making a lot of sense there, but I don't know anybody who's like really doing it really in the real world at any scale that matters.
I'm not aware of anyone that's looking at that. The idea of a transparent citizen-owned identity that is portable, like you would see as part of your Apple Wallet, is exciting, and I think very interesting position that states and or the federal government could play to really drive forward not just state and local government, but the market of identity as a whole. But there really hasn't been that singular leadership, whether that's Department of Homeland Security or directly within CISA. That has not really been a direct strategy for them at this point in time. There are some really interesting investments that are coming out of the federal space. The Infrastructure Act that was signed under the Biden administration last year has about $1 billion associated to it in grant money related to state and local government partnerships related to cybersecurity. No guidance specifically on how they anticipate awarding that and what it's going to be used for. But I mean, it creates interesting questions that can you unify some of that money in a way that drives forward, not just for a singular state, but for a region or even the country?
I feel like when we have this privacy discussion, you can't have the discussion holistically without talking about like Eric Snowden and WikiLeaks and kind of what impact that had. I'm wondering when it comes, because I think most of the privacy regulations that we talk about in our industry, things like CCPA, they don't really apply to government agencies. So I guess the formal question would be, what is driving, or what framework do privacy practitioners use from a government side to determine, hey, what data should we collect and things like that? I'm kind of wondering if the whole WikiLeaks piece kind of like looms over as that kind of influencing that. In other words, hey, if we collect it, at some point, it may become publicly known that we collected it, or is that just something? I mean, I know state governments probably aren't collecting the kind of data that, say, the NSA is collecting. But I'm wondering, like, we hope, right? But what's kind of driving privacy practitioners within these government agencies to determine what data to collect?
So I can't speak to data privacy as a whole, but in the context of identity, and I'll talk about it in two ways: identity proofing and identity affirmation. It is something we talk about every single day. And the reason we talk about it every single day is we want to avoid those data marts, honeypots, WikiLeaks, whatever view you want to apply to it, around the collection of data that potentially creates an attack surface that we're just not interested in taking the risk associated with. So when we talk about identity proofing, so when I initially come in to a digital service and identifying, you are who you say that you are, we have a lot of mechanisms available to us within the state government to facilitate that, but we want to right size the risk of both collecting that information as well as validating it with the service that you're attempting to access. So for example, if you're coming in to pay your taxes, not get a refund, but to pay for yourself or for your business, to a degree, if you're willing to cut that check, we're probably willing to accept that. And we aren't going to go through additional proofing. If you are, for example, getting grant money, or in the case of the federal government, getting a tax refund with the issues that happened there, the bar would be significantly higher. And so part of it is limiting, again, when we are actually attempting to even access that information such that it is risk justified. The second element then is, well, how are we accessing the information? So driver's license is a really popular mechanism in state government. Why? Because we have it. And it's relatively easy for us to reach out and grab it. But as I mentioned earlier, there is a law, the Driver's License Privacy Protection Act, that we do have to evaluate these calls against. And so the approach that we've generally taken is API. And the API isn't send me all the information about Jim McDonald. The API is Jim McDonald said these things about himself. Can you confirm yes or no? And so that limits the information that we're receiving and have to be responsible for. The other element in getting to the biometric piece is the sort of the view, and I'm sure that other spaces have this as well, but the view we apply in the public sector is assume all knowledge-based proofing is compromised. So we would take any information you provide plus a picture of your driver's license plus a picture of you and do a comparison. But we would never store that. We blow it all away. It's real time. It never gets collected. So the footprint is meant to be very small and very transactional as best as possible. And then at that point, all we do is store that you have in fact been proofed and to what level you've been proofed. Yeah. The other element we look at is the identity affirmation piece. So fine, you're in the system. Great. But now you're coming in and you're attempting to perform a certain transaction that is of a higher level. So you're trying to pull information from retirement benefits or cut a check out of your pension or 401k. In that case, we would also look at more of like an adaptive or risk-based view of that transaction and say, all right, so you typically log in with one of these two devices, and that device is geographically located here. And this is the type of login pattern that you follow in terms of the language of your browser. And we would flag that for atypical behavior. And then that would require, again, sort of additional confirmation before that transaction would take place.
Yeah, the latter scenario that you were discussing, I think the buzz term is verified credentials. I kind of went through that process with the ID.me process to get to IRS services just recently, right? As you're going through the process of attaining a mortgage, you have to kind of go and get IRS transcripts and things like that. So recently went through that process, and to your point, it made a big point of saying, look, if you do this automated process, we blow away the data. Your other option is wait and do a video chat with a human being, but the wait time is an hour. Mm-hmm. But hey, you do have the option. Anyway, I wanted to switch topics a little bit. We had, during our preparation for this session, you mentioned an organization called, I think, NACIO. It was the way it's pronounced. NACIO. And yeah, so that's a public sector CIO organization. And what are they talking about in relative to digital identity?
So NACIO, the National Association of State CIOs, in my mind, is the organization to really understand what are the IT priorities across the state sector. So typically, this is a group that meets twice a year. These are decision makers within the individual states. Typically, they are leading the shared departments of IT for that state. and they come together to really talk about, where are you investing? Where do you plan to invest? What are you seeing as a successful way in which you've invested? So that could be vendors, that could be just particular topics and things of that nature. So every year they release a NASCIO top 10 priorities. It typically comes out in the late fall, early winter of the preceding year that says, okay, these are the 10 priorities that we anticipate we will take into, in this case, 2022. And then these are the supporting technology projects that we believe are going to enable those. So if I look at 2022's NASCIO top 10 priorities, number 1 is cybersecurity. Number 2 is digital services. I think number 6 is identity. The idea is that with not just COVID, but I think with the understanding that the digitization of government services drives faster revenue return, better engagement with services, and frankly, just better experience from the user perspective, which ultimately leads them to come back again. There's been a significant investment in that kind of IT modernization to enable that. Obviously, then cybersecurity exposure and the need for a unified citizen identity in this case are going to be critical to that. Underpinning that, if you look at the technology solutions that they're really most focused on, particularly from the citizen perspective, they're pretty early in the life cycle. So they're just focused on, how do I prove out the citizens that are logging in are in fact who they say they are, such that I can move beyond those general services where I'm really not having to proof with any real deep evaluation, to now exposing more sensitive services like retirement benefits and health information, through these digital portals. That these are things like Access Indiana has started to go down this path. Innovate Ohio, I know, has started to go down this path, but many states are really just starting to, frankly, dip a toe in to how digital services supported by a digital citizen identity can really start to be rolled out to their constituencies.
So we focused a lot, talking about the United States, right? And I mean, a lot of our listeners are, at least a third of our listeners are based outside of the United States. How much collaboration is going on, beyond the borders of the United States? Because a lot of what you're talking about seems like these are best practices, not only for the United States, right, but for governments all over the world.
The short answer from a state and local government perspective is none that I'm aware of. Even within state and local government, outside of groups like NASCIO, the information sharing tends to be a bit more regional and partnerships. So if you think about Washington and Oregon, or Maryland and Virginia, or the Carolinas, like, these are groups that share close geographic territory. They have a lot of overlap in businesses and citizens and things of that nature. So they tend to work pretty closely together. In terms of international partnerships, like I said, none. I would say that if you look at it from the federal level and thinking about things like the National Institute of Standards and Technology, those are organizations that are often setting standards that state governments are utilizing. They're also obviously looking at things like standard authentication patterns, OADC and SAML, which have an international flavor to them as well. But I guess the short answer I would say is, indirectly, when you think about industry standards, certainly state and local uses them like anyone else would. But as far as, does Ohio directly talk with members of the EU to define what they're doing from a identity strategy perspective? Absolutely not.
Well, it wouldn't be a conversation about state and local government without talking politics. And before I get to that, I'm curious for NASCIO, there certainly politics play a large role in a lot of different things, but as far as participation at that sort of like CIO level, do you see is it, red versus blue in some of those things? Do everyone pretty much just get along and they're kind of like operating outside of the political spectrum? What's the sort of like, I guess, feel of the room, so to speak?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I would personally say that those sessions are not political, but state CIOs are appointed by the governor's office. So there are potentials where there will be CIOs who lean more political one way or the other. based on their affiliation with the particular governor's office. I would say typically, if you look across the board, the vast majority of those individuals would say that they are IT first, and IT and cyber is a bipartisan issue that really doesn't play on either side of the aisle. So, there are always concerns, particularly in battleground states where if a party affiliation changes over, that these individuals may also change over. But for the most part, these are very specialized roles, people with a lot of experience, in that space working with the state agencies. And so because of that, they tend to be seen as, longer term positions.
Do you find any trends where, I'm thinking like, blue states tend to be more digital first, or red states might be more something else first, or is it pretty universal that everyone kind of gets it, that it's just more about getting, secure access to the state's resources and making sure the services are usable? Do you see any like trends as far as, Democrat versus Republican or independents? You can also pass too if you want to preserve.
I think the trends would be more digital service oriented than I would say cyber oriented, which is to say that a blue state would typically provide more government services than a red state. A blue state would typically have a larger budget in comparison to red states of a similar size. And so because of that, certain blue states have perhaps identified the need for digital identity for their citizens earlier, just because more things are being offered from a digital perspective. That being said, I worked on Innovate Ohio, which is the citizen portal for Ohio for 3 years. That was under Governor Mike DeWine and Lieutenant Governor Husted. That's a red state. So I don't think it's necessarily a red or blue issue. I think anymore people see cyber as a bipartisan issue that really deals with national security.
You talk about a little bit about kind of like the funding cycles and changing over of administrations and how that might impact some of the appointments at the IT level and maybe downstream projects or strategies. I guess, what can you tell us about that sort of political cycle? How does that impact things like funding and strategies and things like that? Because I'd imagine every 2 to 4 years, there's probably some major shakeup. And that's, to me, as I think about it, like from a, how are we going to get things done? That seems like a pretty big concern that I would have in a roadmap somewhere as a risk.
It is and it isn't. It is in that really probably more so the 4-year governor cycle than the 2-year legislative cycle is more impactful. And I'd say it's impactful from a people and from a funding perspective. The people piece we touched on, which is that many of the agency directors and secretaries are directly appointed by the governor. So in the event that governor is not reelected or term limited, or even more so if the party changes over, it is possible that individual will no longer be there when the administration transitions. It's not guaranteed, but it is probably more likely than not that is the case. And so from an execution standpoint, that can potentially slow things down, where as people transition and want to understand what the projects are and the investments that they're making, is that projects may not go live in those windows, or may drag on 6-7 months after anticipated windows to bring new leadership up to speed. Funding is perhaps less impactful, and there's really 2 ways in which these centralized IT departments are funded. One is direct appropriations, and the second is chargebacks. Direct appropriations would typically be driven by, let's say, Maryland, as an example, has an IT modernization, cyber modernization fund where they basically pushed bonds in order to put multiple millions of dollars together to drive various IT projects. That funding, once approved, is earmarked without basically significant effort, is not going to change. Chargebacks are chargebacks from individual agencies. So essentially where you're operating almost as an outsourced IT service provider for those agencies, and then they pay into central IT for that time. Those can be much more impactful because those are really kind of annual based decisions. And if those leaders change over, they may not be inclined to spend their money in that way.
You talk about this thing called the 3 Ps when we were talking before the show. What does that mean?
So that's a Robertism that I came up with to really describe the funding cycle and delivery cycle for these projects with the state. And so the 3Ps are piping, pilot, and pattern. The first two are typically activities that we would be driving out of the centralized IT group. These would be projects with direct appropriations, with definitive timelines, and really being driven by various leaders within those departments of IT. So the idea is whether it's access management or IGA or PAM, that we would stand up the infrastructure, the base configuration, the core testing of use cases that would be used for the enterprise. So lights on, documentation done, core functionality available. We would then coordinate with agencies for the launch of an individual pilot to essentially validate our understanding. So it's like everything sounds great in academia, and then once you apply it in the real world, you obviously have a number of lessons learned that come through that process. That at the end of it, we would incorporate those lessons learned, and that essentially finalizes what we'd call a pattern. And so the pattern then, as agencies choose to onboard from that point going forward, the agencies would pay for that. The agencies would be responsible for bringing individuals to the table, and they would utilize generally documentation generated during that piping and pilot phase to drive the majority of that implementation activity. So it's a way to take kind of a centralized solution and a centralized delivery model and then start to decentralize it across the enterprise in the state or local perspective.
Robert, I'm wondering, are state and local governments, like most corporate organizations I've worked with, coming up with kind of a cloud-first strategy? So are they trying to move to cloud services? And then that got me thinking about, do they have any FedRAMP requirements that they're either governed by or that they are choosing if available?
So there's been a lot of conversation over the course of the last 2 years for a state ramp set of requirements, very similar in nature to what you'd see from a FedRAMP perspective. That is still very much taking shape. Going back to NASCIO, if you look at their top 10 priorities and the technology that supports it, number one is cloud services. So cloud is, I would say, from an enterprise strategy perspective, relatively immature across the state landscape. They're still evaluating how to strategically apply this for benefits across the state. What type of data are we going to put in there? How does this apply for infrastructure versus software? What kind of changes are we going to make to our overall cybersecurity services and audit mechanisms that we use? A lot of that, frankly, hasn't been defined. This is a space, and I pick on vendors sometimes because I think vendors drive a lot of the conversation. But I think vendors that are pushing cloud services right now will help to maybe drive some maturity around that discussion at the state level.
To the cloud.
To the cloud. Here we go.
I want to start to wrap up the conversation because you've been generous with your time. This sparks, though, something I want to bring up that listener out there, Andrew, and also been on the show, Andrew the Chantathone, sent me a LinkedIn message. And I think this is a great opportunity to bring up this question, and it's around the balance of security versus a user experience, because I feel like this is exactly the conversation that's probably taking place as part of that. And I think of he gave me an example of moving away from SMS in favor of more secure MFA methods, and I'll paraphrase things like app-based push authentication, or maybe even if you're really cool, going down like a passwordless route or something like that. What are your thoughts on how does an organization, and let's keep it the state and local kind of flair for this one, help kind of drive that stuff, that sort of maturity or that maturation away from what we consider legacy MFA or other types of legacy technologies like on-prem, maybe moving to a cloud-based approach? How does that balancing act take place? And maybe this is a conversation that takes place in NASCIO, and I'm sure in conference rooms all across different governments. But what are your thoughts on that?
A question that has been brought up more times than I can count in my career. And a big element of why I've talked a lot about not just identity, but digital services is we found that joining to be extremely successful. Every time you layer on security, no matter how great the UX is, always creates friction with the user base. So by looking for opportunities where we weren't just rolling out security, but tagging that to perhaps web application modernization and releasing that in sort of one joint package, created a bit of a balance, right? So I'm getting better services and experience. And while there's a security layer that's maybe new to me, I'm okay with accepting that because I'm getting a better overall experience. So that's sort of big picture. Drilling down into something like MFA, what we often would talk about is, okay, fine, SMS isn't as secure as an application push, but what are they trying to access, right? How critical is it that we push that experience? And if we didn't have a really good risk story around that, then we would typically shy away from that change. So I think, as with most things from a cyber perspective, understanding the risk context that's there is important to drive those decisions, not just looking at it from a cyber lens.
I think the other thing I think about too is that it doesn't have to be a one size fits all. There's probably multiple right answers. Just depends on the use case, context, risk, whatever it is you're trying to address. Jim, in 30 seconds, tell me how you balance security with the user experience.
Yeah, Robert touched on it.
It's easy.
It's all about level of insurance. If you need a high level of assurance, then you have to have appropriate controls that achieve that level of assurance. If you need a high level of assurance as well as you need to reach a broad audience, that's the toughest scenario. But I mean, can you name one banking service where you're able to log in with your Facebook ID or your Google ID? It just doesn't happen, right? Now, I was doing something the other day where it was, again, going through the process of getting a mortgage. You're constantly docu-signing things. This was not DocuSign, but it was some other application to sign a document. They said, do you want to sign up for multi-factor authentication? Which has become ubiquitous enough now that, like, I and probably a lot of people say, yes, I do want that level of protection. But then when I got to it, they would not offer SMS or email as an option. You had to download an authenticator app. And at that point, I said, well, that sounds very inconvenient, right? I have Google Authenticator, but do I want to go through this whole process to link through first DocuSigning? That's become like the Kleenex term, right? To sign a document electronically. Ultimately, I wound up saying, well, after I started seeing what the documents were, I was like, okay, I will register my Google Authenticator. But I bet you most people would say, forget about it.
Friction is too high.
It felt like too high of a bar before I knew what I was going to get. After I saw what was in there, I was willing to go over that bar, but it was still probably a bar, especially if you give people the option to opt out. It may become too high of a bar. But that level of assurance, if you're talking about your employees or you're talking about your privileged access, it's a high level of assurance. And now you can set up those additional hurdles where you need to use a soft token or maybe even a hard token.
I got a Chromecast with Google TV yesterday to add to my collection. And I went through the process last night of setting up all my video services on it. Netflix, Hulu, HBO, Apple, blah, 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 right? All the things that we said would be cheaper independently from a cable subscription. I'm now paying more, but that's a separate conversation. And I must have experienced 5 or 6 different ways to authenticate and connect those services to my media device. And it ranged from having to use a remote control, that doesn't have letters and keyboards on it, and navigating and typing in an email address and, a very long and complicated password for each of these services, to going to the web and doing like an OAuth flow where it's, simpler and easier, to Apple, which I logged in and then it used actually my on-device credentials and facial recognition, and I never had to type anything, which was awesome. I think that's that balance of the usability and security kind of comes back to this. It's like, okay, we're talking about, media streaming. What are we really concerned about? And how do we make that, easier for people to actually consume the services? I get Netflix is down. They're looking for ways to, to increase subscribers or, drive revenue. But at the end of the day, let's make it easy for folks. All right, let's start to wrap things up. Robert, we like to end on a lighter note. And I know that you are a connoisseur of various beverages. You've got a very impressive kind of home bar setup. So I'm going to go with an alcohol theme here for our lighter note. What is your favorite alcohol spirit? And then what is your least favorite?
Yeah, I think we were saying that there's a definite spin-off podcast here, strong opinions on strong spirits, because I have very strong opinions on this. So from a favorite perspective, my view kind of changes over the course of the year. I would say, given that it's beautiful weather here in Charlotte, North Carolina, I would say tequila right now is in my number one spot. I think a lot of times people have their Cuervo scar from at some point in their life, but a huge fan of really great tequilas out there. And I think it's been really fun over the last couple of years that tequila's kind of caught on in the market. On the other end of the spectrum, I know this is a really unpopular opinion, vodka, only because I just don't feel like vodka brings anything to the party. I like to make cocktails. Vodka to me is just a blank slate.
Yeah, it's my vodka story is for a different reason. That's because I had way too many one night, very long time ago, and I've not gone back to the well, and I'm not going to do that anymore.
Yeah, and I promise that cyber projects don't drive me to drink. That's definitely not the case at all.
There's plenty of other things that do that.
Yeah, exactly.
Jim, what about you? What's your favorite and least favorite spirit?
Well, I feel like I need to address the vodka piece, because I think it being a blank slate, and the more blank the slate is, in other words, the more refinement it has, the fewer impurities exist. And when you drink it, you don't have the problems the next day of feeling hungover. So I appreciate that about a good vodka. I think probably the alcohol that I enjoy the most, but I have to make sure I don't drink too much of, is bourbon. Mm-hmm. And then I'm going to pick one that maybe nobody thought of for least favorite, which is an aperitivo called ouzo. If you've had ouzo,
you stole my thunder.
No,
that was my least favorite too. Yeah, exactly. I am not a fan of ouzo. My wife had a drink last night at dinner, and I think it was old fashioned or something. And for whatever it was, they had some sort of ouzo spirit in there, and it was just. Ugh. Yeah, exactly. I see the face Robert's making. You can't see it, but it was definitely not the right thing. Yeah, I'm impressed impressed, shocked, and I guess not shocked at the same time that we don't like the same spirit. Mine is Malibu rum. That's pretty much my go-to. I don't really drink that much to begin with, but I will enjoy a nice sweet coconut rum of some sort. Other than that, I'm pretty basic, man. I'm not much of a drinker. I'll drink port, but we're not talking fortified wines at this point.
Well, you're in the land of breweries where you are now, so I guess you need to venture out that way.
I am. We've got Whistle Hop, literally a hop for me. So tons of breweries here in Western North Carolina, and the Asheville area is a good food and drinking town. So we are certainly enjoying making the rounds and discovering all that the area has to offer, my wife and I. All right, let's go ahead and wrap it up for this week. We're getting a little bit long in the tooth here from a show perspective. Any final thoughts, Robert? What should people be taking away from this conversation as it relates to identity and the state and local, or the fact that ouzo is garbage? What do you want to go with?
First of all, do not get any tequila that has added agave to it. You want to go 100% natural. That is the most important takeaway. Okay. So for those Casamigos fans out there, shots fired, but that is definitely not the best tequila brand on the market. From probably what people actually came here to talk about, which is identity, I think the big thing that I like to tell folks is that as it relates to your state and local governments, is that there is significant time and investment that's being put into understanding what are those services that really make sense to digitize. No one likes to go to the DMV. No one likes to go and wait in long lines. And with that, I see that states are making a more significant investment than many even private institutions are in establishing citizen identity. And I think there is a hope and a vision that over the course of the next 5 to 10 years, that state identity really can become a really unique source of federated identity across public and private sector. So it'll be really interesting to see how that plays out.
Here. I have to get a new driver's license in North Carolina here soon. And it's like a 3-month wait to get an appointment at the DMV to get it done. So hopefully things like that get better as we move things forward from a identity maturity at the state and local level. Jim, how about yourself? Final thoughts for this week?
Yeah, final thoughts are thank you to Andrew for sending us the question. Thank you to Chris for sending us the tweet last time. I encourage all of our listeners, take part in the show by submitting some things like that. And if anyone's going to be out at the Gartner IAM Summit, we'd love to meet, fist bump, as Jeff likes to say. But yeah, and if this is your first time listening, please reach out to us, connect to us on LinkedIn.
And subscribe. That helps us out a lot. We've seen a tremendous growth with the show over the last few years, considering this is all word of mouth. We don't do any advertising or anything. So we certainly appreciate every thumbs up, like, subscribe, share, whatever the thing is that helps get the word out is always appreciated. And definitely if you're going to be a Gartner, hit us up. We'd love to fist bump, do whatever it takes to make sure that we meet up with folks. All right. With that, we're going to go ahead and leave it for this week. We are on the web, identityattthecenter.com. We're on Twitter at IDAC Podcasts. You can connect with us on LinkedIn. Robert, are you cool if we put your LinkedIn profile as part of our show notes if people want to reach out and have kind of questions or thoughts, concerns, or the agave police want to come and arrest you?
Absolutely. Any and all of the above.
Very good. All right. So we'll include that in the show notes. With that, we'll go ahead and leave it for this week. Thanks, everyone, for listening, and we'll talk with everyone in the next one. Thanks for listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe and visit us on the web at identityattthecenter.com.